Walk through Elgin, Illinois today, and you'd never know this quiet city once housed an empire. For 100 years, the Elgin National Watch Company dominated American timekeeping from a factory complex that consumed an entire city block and employed thousands. They built an astronomical observatory to set the nation's clocks. Railroad conductors staked their lives on Elgin precision. Soldiers carried Elgin watches into 2 world wars. The brand wasn't just respected, it was the standard. Then came cheaper competitors, a technological revolution they refused to see, and decades of corporate delusion. The factory was demolished. The clock stopped. How does a company that defined time lose track of it? The story of the Elgin National Watch Company begins not with a watchmaker, but with a problem that was killing people. In the years following the Civil War, America was expanding westward at a furious pace. The railroads were the arteries of that expansion. By the mid-1860s, tens of thousands of miles of track crisscrossed the continent, carrying passengers, freight, and the economic lifeblood of a reuniting nation. But there was a fatal flaw in this system. Time itself was broken. Every city in America kept its own local time. Noon in Chicago wasn't noon in Pittsburgh. A conductor's pocket watch might disagree with a station clock by 15 minutes, and 15 minutes on a single-track railroad meant 2 trains occupying the same stretch of rail at the same moment. The results were catastrophic. Head-on collisions, derailments, and passengers and crew killed because nobody could agree on what time it actually was. Between 1853 and 1870, railroad accidents killed thousands of Americans. The newspapers called it slaughter. Families buried their dead and demanded answers. And the answer, it turned out, wasn't better brakes or stronger rails. It was better watches. In 1864, a group of Chicago businessmen looked at this crisis and saw an opportunity that would reshape American industry. Benjamin W. Raymond, a former mayor of Chicago with deep connections to the railroad world, understood something that most people missed. The country didn't just need watches. It needed precise, reliable, affordable watches produced in quantities that traditional European craftsmanship could never deliver. At that time, if you wanted a quality timepiece in America, you had 2 choices. Import a Swiss or English watch at enormous cost, or buy a handmade American piece that took a single craftsman months to complete. Neither option could serve a nation of expanding railroads and growing cities. The supply was pitiful. The demand was exploding. Raymond assembled a consortium that included Philo Carpenter, a prominent Chicago hardware merchant, and several other investors with the capital and nerve to make something audacious happen. Together, they incorporated the National Watch Company on August 27, 1864, with a capitalization of $100,000. Their mission was radical: build a factory that could mass-produce precision watches using interchangeable parts, the same principle that had revolutionized firearms manufacturing, but had never been applied to something as delicate as a watch movement. Think about that for a second. A watch movement contains dozens of tiny components, gears and springs and jewel bearings, each machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The idea that you could manufacture these parts on machines, make them identical enough to swap between movements, and still produce a timepiece accurate enough to prevent train wrecks was considered borderline insane by European watchmakers. The Swiss had spent centuries perfecting their craft. Individual masters trained for decades. And here were a bunch of American businessmen from Chicago claiming they could do it with machines and factory workers. The audacity was breathtaking. They recruited J.C. Adams and several other skilled watchmakers who understood both the art and the engineering of horology. Adams would become the company's first superintendent, Cameron the man responsible for translating the vision into physical reality. He didn't come alone. The company lured craftsmen from across the existing watch industry, men who knew how to build the specialized machinery that would make mass production possible. Every one of them was betting their career on an idea that had never been proven at scale. Now the location. They chose Elgin, Illinois, a small city roughly 35 miles northwest of Chicago. This wasn't random. Every detail was calculated. Elgin sat along the Fox River, which provided water power for the early machinery. The Galena and Chicago Union Railroad ran right through town, giving direct access to Chicago's massive rail hub and from there to the entire national network. The land was cheap. The labor pool was available. Immigrants and local workers ready for factory jobs. And the distance from Chicago was close enough for easy business travel, but far enough to avoid the city's higher costs and chaos. In 1866, construction began on a hilltop overlooking the Fox River. The site was deliberately elevated, visible from across the city. A statement of ambition before a single watch had been produced. The original factory building was a substantial brick structure designed to house the specialized machinery that would make interchangeable watch parts a reality. From the very first day, the company invested heavily in its own tooling. They didn't buy off-the-shelf equipment. They built custom machines, precision lathes and gear-cutting tools designed specifically for watch components. The factory was meant to be self-sufficient, controlling every stage of production from raw brass and steel to finished, ticking movements. On April 1, 1867, the first Elgin watch movement was completed. It was an 18-size, full-plate movement designated the B.W. Raymond, named after the founding visionary. A railroad-grade watch from day one. Not a toy, not a fashion accessory. A precision instrument designed to keep men alive on the rails. The movement was robust, accurate, and built from parts that could be replaced individually if one component failed. That repairability was revolutionary. If a gear broke in a Swiss watch, you sent it back to the craftsman and waited months. If a gear broke in an Elgin, any jeweler with the right replacement part could fix it in an afternoon. Here's the thing about those first watches. They weren't cheap. They retailed for around $117, a significant sum when skilled workers earned a few dollars a day. But for railroad conductors and engineers whose lives depended on accurate time, the investment was non-negotiable. The railroads themselves began mandating that employees carry watches meeting specific accuracy standards. Elgin met those standards from the very first production run. The company had built exactly what the market desperately needed: a reliable, repairable, American-made precision timepiece, and the market responded. By 1868, demand was outpacing supply. The factory couldn't build watches fast enough. Orders stacked up from railroad companies, jewelers, and individual buyers across the country. The company expanded the factory, added workers, invested in more machinery. The workforce grew from a handful of craftsmen to hundreds within just a few years. In 1874, the company officially changed its name to the Elgin National Watch Company, cementing the city's identity into the brand itself. Elgin wasn't just where the watches were made. It was the watch. The name carried weight, authority, precision, and the factory on the hill above the Fox River was just getting started. The dream of mass-produced American timekeeping had worked. Now came the empire. By the 1870s, the Elgin National Watch Company had solved the production problem. The factory on the hill was running smoothly, turning out movements with a consistency that vindicated every bet the founders had placed. But Elgin's leadership understood something crucial. Making great watches wasn't enough. You had to make the world trust them. And trust, in the watch business, meant one thing above all else: accuracy. Not just good accuracy, perfect accuracy. The kind that could be proven, verified, and stamped on a certificate that a railroad superintendent would stake lives on. So in 1910, Elgin did something no private company in America had ever done. They built their own astronomical observatory. Let that sink in. A watch company constructing a scientific facility to observe the stars. not for research, not for academic prestige, but to determine the exact time and transmit it directly to their factory floor. The Elgin National Watch Observatory became one of only two authoritative time sources in the entire United States, alongside the U.S. Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. A private corporation in a small Illinois city was literally defining what time it was for the nation. The observatory housed a precision transit telescope that tracked star positions as they crossed the meridian. From those observations, astronomers calculated exact sidereal time, converted it to civil time, and wired it to the factory. Every single watch that left the Elgin complex was rated against this astronomically verified standard. The message to customers was devastating in its simplicity. Our time isn't an estimate, it's measured against the stars. Try to compete with that. And competitors couldn't. The observatory gave Elgin a marketing advantage that was nearly impossible to replicate. Advertisements proclaimed that Elgin watches were timed by the stars themselves. It wasn't just branding, it was true. For railroad companies that needed to certify their conductors' watches met strict accuracy standards, the observatory's stamp carried absolute authority. No other American watch manufacturer could make that claim. Waltham was respected. Hamilton was reliable. But Elgin had the observatory. Elgin had the stars. Now back at the factory, the physical complex was transforming into something immense. What had started as a single building on a hilltop had metastasized into a sprawling industrial campus that consumed an entire city block and then some. By the 1890s, and the complex included multiple manufacturing buildings, each dedicated to a specific stage of production. The main movement factory, where tiny gears, springs, and plates were machined to microscopic tolerances. A case manufacturing facility where gold, silver, and nickel housings were stamped, shaped, and polished. Tool shops where Elgin's engineers built and maintained the custom machinery that made everything possible. Power plants, storage warehouses, testing laboratories where finished movements endured days of accuracy trials in multiple positions and temperatures before they earned the Elgin name. The factory floor was a marvel of organized precision. Rows of specialized machines stretched across vast rooms, each one performing a single operation on a single component. One machine cut gear teeth, another drilled jewel settings, another polished pivot points to mirror smoothness. Workers tended these machines with the focused attention of surgeons, because at these tolerances, a moment's lapse meant a ruined part. Picture this: the air thick with cutting oil and brass dust. The sound, not the thundering roar of a steel mill, but something more precise, more insistent. A constant, high-pitched whir of spinning lathes and the rhythmic click of stamping presses, like the ticking of 1,000 watches amplified to fill a cathedral. That was the sound of Elgin at work. That was the sound of time being manufactured. By the turn of the century, the factory employed over 3,500 workers. During peak years, that number climbed past 4,000. Every morning, a river of men and women flowed through the gates, lunch pails in hand. And for 8 to 10 hours, they performed the exacting, repetitive work of building timepieces, one component at a time. The output was staggering. In its best years, the factory produced over 500,000 watch movements annually. By 1910, cumulative production surpassed 20 million movements. By the time it was all over, Elgin would manufacture more than 60 million watches. 60 million. No American watch company would ever come close. But the factory wasn't just an economic engine. It was a gravitational force that reshaped everything around it. The transformation of Elgin from a modest Fox River settlement into a thriving industrial city happened with a speed that defies logic. Before the watch factory arrived, Elgin was a quiet agricultural town, known mostly for dairy farms and butter production. Population in 1860 hovered around 2,000. By 1880, it surged past 8,000. By 1900, it exceeded 22,000. By 1920, pushing toward 28,000. That kind of growth doesn't happen because of good weather. It happens because a factory is hiring. The watch company was the largest employer in the city by a mile, and its influence radiated into every corner of daily life. Workers needed housing, so neighborhoods sprouted around the factory district. Rows of modest homes filled the streets within walking distance of the plant. Landlords rented rooms to single workers who'd arrived from other states or from Europe, drawn by the promise of steady wages. Grocery stores, bakeries, butcher shops, dry goods merchants, all open to serve the swelling population. Taverns and saloons lined the main streets, packed every evening with workers spending their pay. Churches went up. Schools expanded. A public library was built. Social clubs formed around ethnic communities because the workforce was a patchwork of immigrant groups. German, Irish, Swedish, and later Polish and Italian families all settled in Elgin, each carving out their own neighborhoods while sharing the common bond of factory work. Here's the thing. The watch company didn't just employ these people, it organized their lives. Shift schedules determined when families ate dinner. Factory whistles told the town when to wake up and when to go home. The rhythms of production became the rhythms of existence itself. And Elgin's management knew exactly how powerful this was. The company cultivated a paternalistic relationship with its workforce, company picnics, holiday celebrations, a carefully constructed sense of belonging that said working for Elgin meant being part of something larger than yourself. For decades it worked. Workers stayed for entire careers. Sons followed fathers into the factory. Daughters worked the lines until they married, and sometimes long after. The company was the town's identity, its economy, its culture, and its future, all wrapped into one. The cultural significance of Elgin watches stretched far beyond Illinois. By the early 1900s, an Elgin was one of the most recognizable consumer products in America. Railroad conductors carried them because regulations demanded timepieces meeting strict accuracy certifications, and Elgin movements passed those tests consistently. But it wasn't just railroad men. An Elgin pocket watch was what a father gave his son on graduation day. What a company awarded an employee after 25 years. What a soldier tucked into his chest pocket before shipping overseas. The watch wasn't just a tool, it was a marker of moments that mattered. A physical object that carried the weight of milestones and memories. Walk into a jewelry store anywhere in America between 1890 and 1950, and you'd find Elgin watches in the display case, positioned as the standard. The company's advertisements ran in every major publication featuring confident men and elegant women, all trusting their time to Elgin. The tagline changed over the decades. The message never did. Elgin is accurate. Elgin is reliable. Elgin is American. By 1913, the company had manufactured its 30 millionth watch. The brand wasn't just succeeding, it was saturating the entire market. If you kept time in America, odds were damn good you kept it on an Elgin. But here's the thing about empires built on a single product in a single factory in a single town. When that product falters, everything falters with it. The factory, the workers, the town, the entire ecosystem. It all hangs on one thread, and threads, no matter how strong they look, eventually fray. By the early 1900s, the Elgin National Watch Company had achieved something most businesses only fantasize about. Total market dominance backed by cultural entrenchment so deep, the brand had become almost invisible in its ubiquity. Like Singer with sewing machines, Elgin had reached the point where the product and the company name were nearly interchangeable. You didn't check your watch. You checked your Elgin. The company wasn't just selling timepieces, it was selling trust, reliability, a particular vision of American competence that resonated from Wall Street boardrooms to Kansas wheat farms. The numbers from this era are staggering. At peak capacity, the Elgin factory produced over 500,000 watch movements per year, 500,000 precision instruments flowing out of a single complex in a single Midwestern city. Let that sink in. The workforce topped 4,000 during the busiest years, making the factory not just the largest employer in Elgin, but one of the largest watch manufacturing operations on Earth. The complex had grown into a sprawling campus of interconnected buildings, each humming with the particular energy of mass precision. The main movement factory alone contained hundreds of specialized machines, each performing one exacting operation in a sequence that transformed raw brass and steel into ticking movements capable of keeping time to within seconds per day. The production process was a symphony of specialization. Raw materials arrived at the loading docks, brass sheets, steel rods, rubies for jewel bearings, and entered a pipeline that would touch dozens of hands and machines before emerging as a finished product. The plate department stamped and milled the main plates forming the skeleton of each movement. The gear department cut teeth so fine they were barely visible to the naked eye. The spring department coiled and tempered hairsprings, the single most critical component in any mechanical watch, a strip of metal so thin and so precisely formed that its vibration determined whether the watch gained or lost time. One imperfect hairspring and the entire movement was worthless. The jewel department set rubies into brass settings, creating low-friction bearings that allowed gears to spin freely for decades. The dial department painted and printed faces, applying numerals with a steadiness that left zero room for error. And the assembly department brought it all together. Skilled workers fitting dozens of components under magnifying loops, these tweezers in hand, breath held, because a single misplaced part could jam a movement that had taken hundreds of man-hours to produce. Quality control was relentless. Finished movements were tested in multiple positions: dial up, dial down, pendant up, pendant left, pendant right. Each position affected the rate differently, and a truly great watch had to perform consistently in all of them. Movements that failed were disassembled, corrected, retested. Nothing left the factory floor unless it met Elgin's published accuracy standards, and those standards, backed by the observatory's astronomical observations, were among the strictest in the industry. Then came the first great test of the company's adaptability. In April of 1917, the United States entered World War I, and everything changed overnight. The government needed precision instruments for the war effort. Not just watches, but fuses, timers, navigation tools, anything requiring the kind of exacting manufacturing Elgin had mastered over half a century. The factory pivoted. Production lines calibrated for pocket watch movements were retooled for military equipment. The transition wasn't seamless, it never is. But Elgin's infrastructure and workforce were uniquely suited to the task. These were people who'd spent years working at tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Military production demanded precision. Precision was what Elgin did. The workforce swelled as the company hired aggressively to meet government contracts. And for the first time in significant numbers, women entered the factory not as support staff, but as production workers. They operated lathes, inspected components, assembled military instruments with the same skill as their male counterparts. The war opened doors that had been slammed shut, and though many would narrow again when the men returned, the precedent was set. But here's the problem. The war did something else, something that would echo through the next several decades and eventually help destroy Elgin. It popularized the wristwatch. Before World War I, real men carried pocket watches. Wristwatches were considered feminine. Novelties, not serious timekeeping instruments, but soldiers in the trenches couldn't fish a pocket watch out of their vest while dodging artillery. They needed time on their wrist, instantly visible, hands-free. Military-issued wristwatches became standard equipment, and when those soldiers came home, they kept wearing them. Think about that. The market was shifting beneath Elgin's feet. Pocket watches, the product that had built the empire, the product the entire factory was designed and optimized to produce, were slowly becoming relics. Younger buyers wanted wristwatches. The bulky pocket watch and its chain looked increasingly old-fashioned. Elgin saw this happening. They weren't blind. In the 1920s and 1930s, they began producing wristwatch movements, adapting their lines to smaller, thinner calibers. But here's the kicker. Elgin's DNA was pocket watches. Their machinery, their expertise, their institutional knowledge, all honed over decades for full-size movements. Wristwatch movements were fundamentally different. Smaller, more delicate, requiring different engineering and different manufacturing techniques. Elgin's early wristwatches felt like what they were. The pocket watch technology shrunk down and crammed into a smaller case. They worked, they were reliable, but they lacked the elegance that Swiss manufacturers were already bringing to the wristwatch market. Companies like Omega, Longines, and the emerging Rolex were designing wristwatch movements from scratch, purpose-built for the format. Thinner profiles, more efficient winding mechanisms, water resistance, shock protection. The Swiss were innovating specifically for the wrist, while Elgin was adapting reluctantly from the pocket. A subtle difference. But in a market where style and engineering were converging, subtle differences mattered enormously. Still, through the 1920s and into the 1930s, Elgin remained dominant. The brand carried enormous goodwill. The observatory still set the standard. The factory still employed thousands. Revenue was strong. The Great Depression hit hard, as it hit everyone. Sales plummeted. Production scaled back. But Elgin survived. They tightened belts, reduced the workforce, waited for the economy to recover. The factory endured. The brand endured. By the late 1930s, business was recovering. Orders were climbing. The factory hummed again. And then, on the horizon, another war was building. A war that would dwarf the first. A war that would transform Elgin's factory into a military arsenal for the second time and push the company to production heights it had never imagined. But it would also accelerate the very forces already quietly undermining the empire. The wristwatch revolution, foreign competition, and a dangerous complacency born from decades of being number one. The golden age was still shining, but the light was about to shift. On December 7, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. America was at war. Within months, the federal government issued orders that would transform every major factory in the country. Civilian production stopped. Everything, every machine, every worker, every ounce of raw material was to serve the military. Elgin didn't hesitate. They'd done this before in 1917. They knew the drill. But World War II was a different beast entirely. The scale was larger, the stakes were existential, and the government's demands were relentless. The factory converted completely. Production lines that had spent decades crafting delicate watch movements were retooled to manufacture military instruments. Precision fuses for artillery shells, altimeters for aircraft, timing mechanisms for bombs, navigation instruments for ships and submarines. Every one of these products required the same obsessive accuracy that watchmaking demanded. Tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Components that had to function perfectly under extreme conditions. In freezing cockpits at 30,000 feet, on pitching decks in the Pacific, in desert heat that could warp lesser materials. Elgin's workforce had spent generations mastering exactly this kind of precision. Now they applied it to the machinery of death. The workforce exploded. Thousands of new hires flooded the factory as production ramped to levels the complex had never seen. 3 shifts, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. The factory never sleeping, never pausing. The gates that had once processed 4,000 workers now handled far more as Elgin became one of the critical nodes in America's wartime industrial network. And once again, women filled the gaps. As men shipped off to Europe and the Pacific, women stepped onto the factory floor in massive numbers. They operated the lathes. They assembled the fuses. They inspected finished components under magnifying loupes with the same steady hands and sharp eyes the work demanded regardless of gender. The war proved it for the second time in a generation. Capability has nothing to do with who you are. It has everything to do with what you can do. Government contracts poured in. The money was good, paid reliably, and at scale. Elgin was profitable during the war years in ways peacetime production could never match. The factory hummed with purpose, and the town hummed with it. Full employment, overtime pay, a sense of patriotic mission that gave the grinding work a meaning beyond the paycheck. Workers weren't just making instruments, they were helping win the war. Planes flew with Elgin altimeters, bombs detonated on Elgin timers, sailors navigated by Elgin instruments. The company that had timed America's railroads was now timing America's war effort. But wars end. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The celebrations that swept the nation were followed almost immediately by harsh reality. Government contracts evaporated. The swollen workforce had to be slashed. Soldiers came home expecting jobs, and the factory had to retool once more, converting back to civilian watch production after years of making weapons. The transition was rocky. Supplier relationships had to be rebuilt, machinery recalibrated, workers retrained on products they hadn't touched in years. It took time. And during that time, the world kept moving. Chapter 5. The War Machine. On December 7, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. America was at war. Within months, the federal government issued orders that would transform every major factory in the country. Civilian production stopped. Everything, every machine, every worker, every ounce of raw material was to serve the military. Elgin didn't hesitate. They'd done this before in 1917. They knew the drill. But World War II was a different beast entirely. The scale was larger. The stakes were existential. And the government's demands were relentless. The factory converted completely. Production lines that had spent decades crafting delicate watch movements were retooled to manufacture military instruments. Precision fuses for artillery shells, altimeters for aircraft, timing mechanisms for bombs, navigation instruments for ships and submarines. Every one of these products required the same obsessive accuracy that watchmaking demanded. Tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Components that had to function perfectly under extreme conditions, in freezing cockpits at 30,000 feet, on pitching decks in the Pacific, in desert heat that could warp lesser materials. Elgin's workforce had spent generations mastering exactly this kind of precision. Now they applied it to the machinery of death. The workforce exploded. Thousands of new hires flooded the factory as production ramped to levels the complex had never seen. 3 shifts, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. The factory never sleeping, never pausing. Now, the gates that had once processed 4,000 workers now handled far more as Elgin became one of the critical nodes in America's wartime industrial network. And once again, women filled the gaps. As men shipped off to Europe and the Pacific, women stepped onto the factory floor in massive numbers. They operated the lathes. They assembled the fuses. They inspected finished components under magnifying loupes with the same steady hands and sharp eyes the work demanded regardless of gender. The war proved it for the second time in a generation. Capability has nothing to do with who you are. It has everything to do with what you can do. Government contracts poured in. The money was good, paid reliably, and at scale. Elgin was profitable during the war years in ways peacetime production could never match. The factory hummed with purpose, and the town hummed with it. Full employment, overtime pay, a sense of patriotic mission that gave the grinding work a meaning beyond the paycheck. Workers weren't just making instruments, they were helping win the war. Planes flew with Elgin altimeters, bombs detonated on Elgin timers, sailors navigated by Elgin instruments. The company that had timed America's railroads was now timing America's war effort. But wars end. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The celebrations that swept the nation were followed almost immediately by harsh reality. Government contracts evaporated. The swollen workforce had to be slashed. Soldiers came home expecting jobs, and the factory had to retool once more, converting back to civilian watch production after years of making weapons. The transition was rocky. Supplier relationships had to be rebuilt. Machinery recalibrated. Workers retrained on products they hadn't touched in years. It took time. And during that time, the world kept moving. Chapter 6. The Dark Truth. Behind the gleaming watches and the proud factory tours, there was another Elgin. One that didn't make it into the advertisements. The polished showrooms and magazine spreads told one story. The factory floor told a different one entirely. Workers spent their shifts performing repetitive tasks, demanding intense concentration for hours on end. Watchmaking at industrial scale wasn't the romantic craft that company brochures suggested. It was factory work, period. You sat at a bench, hunched over a machine or a magnifying loupe, performing the same operation hundreds of times a day, cutting the same gear, setting the same jewel, adjusting the same spring. The precision required was extraordinary. The work itself was monotonous, numbing. The kind of repetition that dulls the mind while destroying the body. Eye strain was epidemic. Workers who spent years squinting through loupes developed vision problems that followed them for life. The lighting, while better than many plants of the era, was still inadequate for work demanding microscopic focus. Headaches were constant. Neck and back pain from hunched posture became chronic conditions that workers accepted as the price of employment. No ergonomic workstations, no adjustable seating, no occupational health programs worth a damn. You sat on whatever stool was available, and you worked until the whistle blew. The chemical exposures were worse, much worse. Watch dials required luminous paint so numbers could be read in darkness. And for decades that paint contained radium. The women who applied it, the dial painters, used fine brushes. They pointed with their lips to maintain a sharp tip. Lip, dip, paint, lip, dip, paint. Hundreds of times per shift, ingesting tiny amounts of radioactive material with every stroke. The consequences were devastating. Radium accumulated in bones, cancers, jaw necrosis, anemia, slow, agonizing deaths. The story of the radium girls across the watch dial industry remains one of the most horrifying chapters in American industrial history. Companies knew the risks long before they told workers. Production continued. Profits came first. Beyond the radium, workers breathed cutting oils, chemical solvents, brass and metal dust that hung in the air and coated lungs over years of exposure. Ventilation was minimal. The cumulative toll on health was significant, though much of it wouldn't be understood or acknowledged for decades. And then there were the wages. Elgin's workers were skilled. The precision demanded of them exceeded most factory jobs, but their paychecks didn't reflect it. Management kept wages competitive enough to retain people, but never generous enough to threaten margins. Women earned significantly less than men for equally demanding work. Standard practice across American industry. But standard doesn't mean just. The company actively discouraged unions for most of its history. Organized labor was viewed as a threat to control and efficiency. Supervisors monitored every move, every break, every conversation. Step out of line and you were gone. And in a company town where Elgin was the primary employer, losing your factory job meant losing everything. The message was clear: you're replaceable. Immigrant workers faced additional exploitation, given the worst positions, the dirtiest tasks, the most physically punishing work. Language barriers made advocacy nearly impossible. Foremen wielded enormous power over workers who couldn't afford to complain. The hierarchy inside the factory mirrored the social hierarchies outside it. Those at the bottom always carried the heaviest load. Meanwhile, the Swiss were getting better. Through the 1930s and 1940s, Swiss watchmakers continued refining their wristwatch designs. Omega released movements that were thinner, more accurate, more elegantly engineered than anything Elgin produced. Longines pushed innovations in automatic winding. Wow, and Rolex was building a reputation for waterproof wristwatches that could survive conditions that would destroy an Elgin. The Swiss weren't just competing, they were redefining what a wristwatch could be. Elgin's response was sluggish. Their wristwatch movements improved incrementally, but the fundamental approach hadn't changed. Still a pocket watch company trying to adapt. The brand name still carried weight. Sales remained strong through the 1940s and into the early 1950s, but underneath those numbers, the foundation was cracking. The product was falling behind. The workforce was undervalued, and management, insulated by decades of dominance, couldn't see the world changing faster than they were willing to change with it. The market had already shifted. Elgin just hadn't admitted it yet. The 1950s should have been a wake-up call. They weren't. After the war, the American watch market entered a strange twilight. Elgin was selling watches. The brand name still carried enough weight to move product off shelves and out of display cases. But the trajectory had changed. Sales weren't climbing. They were plateauing. Some years, slipping. The company that had once set the pace for an entire industry was now struggling to keep up with it. The problem was saturation. Just like Singer with sewing machines, Elgin had spent decades building watches so well they didn't need replacing. A properly maintained Elgin pocket watch could run for 50 years. Wristwatches lasted decades. American households that wanted an Elgin already had one, often handed down from a previous generation. You guess, the product's own quality was cannibalizing future sales. Here's the cruel irony. They built them too damn well, and the customers who were buying new watches, the younger generation coming of age in the 1950s and 1960s, they weren't looking at Elgin. They were looking at sleek Swiss imports, thinner cases, automatic winding mechanisms, designs that felt modern, rather than inherited. Elgin felt like something your grandfather wore, and in a market driven by aspiration, that was a death sentence. But the Swiss weren't the only threat. A technological earthquake was building in Japan, and Elgin either didn't feel the tremors or chose to ignore them. In 1969, Seiko introduced the Astron, the world's first commercial quartz wristwatch. That moment should have sent every mechanical watch manufacturer into emergency mode. Quartz technology didn't just improve on mechanical watchmaking, it obliterated it. A quartz watch used a battery-powered electronic oscillator regulated by a quartz crystal to keep time with accuracy that mechanical movements could never approach. Seconds per month versus seconds per day. The technology was cheaper to produce, required almost no maintenance, could be manufactured at a scale that dwarfed anything a traditional factory could achieve. Think about that for a second. Elgin had spent a century perfecting mechanical precision. They'd built an observatory to measure time against the stars. They'd trained generations of workers to machine components to tolerances that pushed the limits of human capability. and now a tiny piece of quartz crystal powered by a battery could outperform all of it. Every master watchmaker, in every precision lathe, every jewel bearing polish to mirror smoothness, all of it rendered irrelevant by something that cost a fraction of the price and kept better time sitting in a drugstore display rack. The Japanese manufacturers, led by Seiko and followed by Citizen and Casio, flooded the global market through the 1970s. The prices were devastatingly low. A quartz watch keeping near perfect time could be had for the cost of a modest dinner. Swiss manufacturers were hammered. American manufacturers were annihilated. The entire economic model of traditional watchmaking, high-skill labor, expensive materials, complex assembly, collapsed almost overnight. This wasn't evolution. It was extinction, and Elgin's response was catastrophically inadequate. Like every American watch company caught in the quartz crisis, they were paralyzed by the gap between what they knew and what the market now demanded. Their factory was built to make mechanical movements. Their workers were trained to make mechanical movements. Their entire identity was mechanical movements. Pivoting to quartz meant massive capital investment in new equipment, retraining an entire workforce, abandoning the very craftsmanship that defined the brand. It was a gut-wrenching proposition, and management couldn't pull the trigger. Instead, they did what desperate companies always do. They diversified, and they did it badly. Through the 1950s and 1960s, as the core watch business weakened, Elgin's leadership expanded into other product areas: defense electronics, military timing devices, instruments leveraging their precision expertise. On paper, it made sense. In practice, it drained resources and attention from the watch business at the exact moment the watch business needed every ounce of investment it could get. Sound familiar? It damn well should. Singer did the exact same thing. When sewing machine sales slowed, Singer dove into aerospace and defense and calculators, spreading resources across industries they didn't understand while neglecting the product that built the empire. Elgin followed the same playbook, almost step for step, as if the script had been written in advance and both companies were reading from it. Chase shiny objects. Neglect the foundation. Watch everything crumble. The bleeding accelerated through the 1960s. Market share fell off a cliff. Cheaper Swiss watches captured the mid-range. Japanese quartz captured the entry level. Elgin, he's stuck in between with aging products and aging infrastructure, lost ground on every front. The workforce that had once topped 4,000 shrank year after year. Production lines went quiet. Entire sections of the complex sat idle, machines gathering dust. The silence in those empty rooms a brutal contrast to the decades of humming precision that had filled them. Revenue declined. Profits vanished. The company that had manufactured over 60 million watches, that had timed the nation's railroads, that had armed the military in 2 world wars, was dying. Not in a dramatic explosion, in a slow, agonizing bleed. Every quarterly report worse than the last. Every year, more layoffs, more closed lines, more empty buildings. The empire hollowing out from the inside. By the early 1960s, the end was visible to anyone willing to look. In 1964, the last watch movement was assembled inside the Elgin factory. 100 years after the company's founding, the production lines went silent for the final time. The machines that had stamped and cut and polished and assembled 60 million precision instruments were shut down. The workers who remained walked out of the factory gates knowing they wouldn't walk back in. 100 years of continuous watchmaking. Done. Generations of families whose entire lives had been spent inside those walls. Fathers who taught sons. Mothers who trained daughters. A century of skill and knowledge and institutional memory, all of it ending not with a ceremony or a monument, but with a quiet shutdown and a locked gate. The watches stopped being made in Elgin, and something in the soul of the city stopped with them. When the last workers walked out of the Elgin factory, they didn't just leave behind empty buildings. They left behind a wound that would take decades to even begin healing. The closure didn't arrive as a single clean break. It was a slow strangulation that had been tightening since the late 1950s. Every round of layoffs, every shuttered production line, every quarterly report worse than the last, another turn of the noose. But when it finally ended, the finality was crushing. The immediate impact on Elgin, Illinois, was catastrophic. The watch company had been the city's economic spine for a century, not just the largest employer, but the gravitational center around which the entire local economy orbited. The grocery stores, the restaurants, the bars where workers cashed paychecks on Friday nights, the landlords who rented rooms to factory hands, the shops selling clothes and shoes and hardware to families supported by Elgin wages. All of it depended on the factory. When the factory died, the ecosystem died with it. Unemployment surged. Workers who'd spent entire careers mastering precision watchmaking found themselves in a labor market with no use for their skills. These were people who could machine a gear to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, who could assemble a movement with tweezers under magnification, who understood metallurgy and horology at an intuitive level built over decades of practice. None of that mattered anymore. The service economy didn't need watchmakers. The new manufacturing jobs, if you could find them, were in different cities, different states, different industries entirely. Some retrained, many couldn't. Some gave up entirely, broken by the sudden collapse of everything they'd known. The social fabric frayed fast. Neighborhoods built to house factory workers deteriorated as families left chasing employment elsewhere. Property values dropped. Storefronts emptied. Main streets that had buzzed during shift changes grew quiet. Crime increased as poverty spread, and hopelessness settled in. The pattern was identical to Elizabethport after Singer closed. Identical to dozens of American manufacturing towns when their anchor employers vanished. The script never changes. Factory closes. Jobs disappear. People leave or struggle. The town hollows out. And the company that built it walks away without looking back. Elgin's management didn't invest in transition programs, no major severance proportional to decades of service. No retraining initiatives, no community funds to cushion the blow. The company had extracted a century of labor from the people of Elgin, Illinois, built an empire worth hundreds of millions on their precision and dedication. And when that empire crumbled, those people were left to fend for themselves. That's not corporate negligence. That's abandonment. Then there was what they left in the ground. Industrial operations spanning 100 years had poisoned the soil and groundwater beneath the factory, chemical solvents used to clean watch components, cutting oils, metal dust. The residues of a century of manufacturing had seeped into the earth. The environmental footprint didn't disappear when the workers did. It stayed. Invisible but persistent, contaminating the ground where the empire had stood. Parts of the factory complex were eventually demolished. The wrecking balls that took down the buildings also destroyed the physical evidence of what had been one of the most impressive manufacturing operations in American history, where precision instruments had been crafted by the millions, where astronomers had measured time against the stars, where generations had spent their lives building something extraordinary. Rubble, then cleared land, then the slow, uncertain question of what comes next. Not everything was destroyed. The Elgin National Watch Observatory survived, repurposed, and preserved as a historical landmark, a small monument to the company's most audacious achievement. But the main factory complex, the heart of the operation, the place where 60 million watches were born, was gone, demolished, be erased from the landscape as thoroughly as the company had been erased from the market. The Elgin name didn't die when the factory closed. It did something arguably worse. It became a ghost, A brand without a body, a name without a soul. After production ended in Illinois, the company went through a series of corporate convulsions that stripped away everything the brand had once represented. The watch division was sold, restructured, sold again. Each new owner saw the same thing. A famous name that could be licensed and stamped on products manufactured cheaply overseas. The craftsmanship was gone. The factory was gone. The workers were gone. But the name still had commercial value. And in the modern economy, that's all you need. Today you can still buy an Elgin watch. They're available online, in department stores, in the kind of display cases where brand recognition matters more than substance. Manufactured in China. Assembled in factories with no connection to the hilltop complex overlooking the Fox River. The movements inside them are mass-produced quartz modules, generic and interchangeable. A far cry from the hand-fitted mechanical calibers that once earned the observatory's stamp of approval. The watches work fine. They keep time. But they carry the Elgin name the way a taxidermied animal carries the shape of life, recognizable but fundamentally empty. The company that once employed over 4,000 people in a single factory, that built its own astronomical observatory, that produced more than 60 million watches. That timed the railroads and armed the military. Now it exists as a trademark managed by licensing agreements. No Elgin watchmakers. No Elgin factory, no observatory rating movements against the stars. Just a name on a box, shipped from a factory you'll never see. Made by workers you'll never meet. The transformation is total, from American industrial powerhouse to foreign manufactured commodity brand. The fall is as complete as it is invisible. For people of a certain age, the name still resonates. Grandparents who received an Elgin pocket watch as a graduation gift. Families who kept one on the mantelpiece, wound it weekly, trusted it to keep the household on time. Collectors who understand the mechanical artistry of vintage movements, who know what it meant to machine those components to those tolerances with that level of care. For them, Elgin means something real. For younger generations, it's just another name on a watch face. No more meaningful than any other brand in a crowded market. The history invisible. The legacy forgotten. The connection severed completely. And then there's the city itself. Elgin, Illinois, spent decades reinventing itself. And the process was long, uneven, and painful. New businesses trickled in over the years. The economy gradually broadened. Healthcare, education, retail, service industries filled some of the gap. The city functions. People live there, raise families, build lives. But some gaps don't fill. The particular pride that came from being the watch city, from having a world-famous product stamped with your town's name, that's gone. Nothing has replaced it. The watch company gave Elgin a place in history. Its absence left the city searching for a new identity that has been slow in arriving and modest in scope. The factory site tells the final chapter of the physical story. Where the complex once stood, where machinery hummed and smokestacks rose and thousands streamed through the gates every morning, the landscape now bears almost no trace of what came before. Some structures repurposed, others torn down. The land remediated where contamination demanded it. A quiet acknowledgement of the century-long environmental cost. The hilltop overlooking the Fox River, once crowned by the most productive watch factory in American history, has been absorbed back into the ordinary fabric of a Midwestern city. If you didn't know what had been there, you'd never guess. And that erasure might be the most haunting detail of all. Empires are supposed to leave monuments. Elgin left an absence. So what can we learn from the rise and fall of the Elgin National Watch Company? Because this isn't just a story about watches. It's a blueprint for how dominance becomes irrelevance, how empires built over generations disintegrate in less than one, And the lessons are so clear, they practically scream from the ruins. Lesson 1. Innovate or die. Elgin spent 100 years mastering mechanical watchmaking. A century. They were the best in the world. Their observatory measured time against the stars. Their workers machined components to tolerances that bordered on miraculous. And none of it mattered when quartz arrived. Not one bit. The century of expertise. The millions invested in specialized machinery. The institutional knowledge passed through generations of craftsmen. All of it became worthless the moment a battery-powered crystal could do the job better and cheaper. Mastery of yesterday's technology is not a strategy. It's a death sentence wearing a resume. The market doesn't care how good you were. It cares what you can do now. And if the answer is the same thing you did 20 years ago, you're already dead. You just haven't stopped breathing yet. Elgin had the resources, the talent, and the brand to lead the quartz transition. They could have been the ones. Instead, they watched from the sidelines while Japanese companies rewrote the entire industry. Innovation isn't optional. It's oxygen. Stop breathing and you suffocate, no matter how strong your lungs used to be. Lesson 2. Don't abandon your core. When watch sales declined, the Elgin's management made the same catastrophic mistake Singer made a decade earlier. They diversified into industries they didn't understand: defense electronics, military instruments, ventures that had nothing to do with the product and expertise that had built the company over a century. The logic seemed sound. Spread the risk, find new revenue. But the execution was disastrous. Resources that should have been poured into modernizing the watch business, into researching quartz, into redesigning products for a changing market, were diverted into unfamiliar territories where Elgin had no competitive advantage. The watch division, still the most recognizable part of the company, was starved of investment at the exact moment it needed everything. Diversification isn't inherently wrong, but it has to build on what you already do well. It has to extend your strengths, not distract from them. When you abandon your core to chase industries you don't understand, you don't reduce risk. You multiply it. You end up mediocre at everything instead of excellent at one thing. And mediocrity in a competitive market is a slow death. Lesson 3. Listen to the market. The wristwatch revolution didn't ambush anyone. It started during World War I. More than 4 decades before Elgin closed, soldiers came home wearing wristwatches. Fashion shifted. Consumer preferences evolved. The signs were visible for decades, and quartz didn't arrive overnight either. Electronic timekeeping had been in development since the 1920s. Quartz oscillators were used in labs and broadcast stations for years before miniaturization brought them to consumer products. Elgin had decades of warning, in multiple decades, and they responded with incremental adjustments rather than fundamental transformation. Slightly modified versions of what they'd always made. Trusting the Elgin name to carry them through. It didn't. Markets don't care about your history. They don't owe you loyalty because your grandfather bought one of your products. Markets move forward, always. If you're not listening to what customers want today, if you're assuming they still want what they wanted yesterday, the market will leave you behind without a backward glance. Elgin stopped listening. The market stopped waiting. Lesson 4. Legacy isn't just about profit. For 100 years, the Elgin National Watch Company provided jobs, built a community, contributed to the economic and cultural fabric of an entire city. That's worth honoring. But legacy is also what you leave behind when you're gone. And what Elgin left behind was devastation. No meaningful transition for workers who'd given their careers. No retraining programs. No community investment to soften the collapse. The company that had been the economic heart of Elgin, Illinois, for a century simply stopped beating. And the city was left to survive the cardiac arrest alone. Add the environmental contamination, the poisoned soil and groundwater from 100 years of industrial operations, and the legacy turns even darker. Elgin extracted labor, loyalty, and health from its workers and its community for generations. When it was done, it walked away. That's not business. That's extraction. Successful companies owe something to the people who built them and the places that housed them. When you take everything and leave nothing, the ruins speak louder than any annual report ever could. And then there's the lesson underneath all the others. The one that makes this more than just another corporate autopsy. The irony of time. Here's the thing that should keep every business leader awake at 3 in the morning. The Elgin National Watch Company was in the business of measuring time. They built an observatory to capture it. They machined instruments to divide it into precise, reliable increments. They defined what time meant for an entire nation. And yet, when it came to reading the signs of their own era, they were blind. They could measure a second to fractions of a fraction, but they couldn't see the decades turning against them. The wristwatch transition was a generational shift they ignored too long. The quartz revolution was a technological earthquake they refused to prepare for. Cultural changes, market shifts, competitive threats, all ticking away like a clock they refused to read. A company that literally owned time couldn't see the future. That's not just ironic. It's the purest distillation of why empires fall. Not because they lack capability, not because they lack resources, but because success breeds blindness. A conviction that because you've always been on top, you always will be. The clocks keep ticking whether you're watching or not. And by the time you realize you've run out of time, there's no winding the mechanism back. The Elgin National Watch Company built 60 million watches. They timed the railroads that stitched a continent together. They armed the military that won 2 world wars. They set the standard for precision that an entire industry measured itself against. They employed generations, built a city, put their name in every pocket and on every wrist in America. And then they were gone. The factory demolished. The workers scattered. The brand reduced to a label on imported products bearing no resemblance to what Elgin once meant. From a hilltop factory overlooking the Fox River to a logo on a box shipped from China. From 60 million watches to 0. From defining American time to being forgotten by it. The story of Elgin is a warning. Plain and simple. Your victories don't protect you from your mistakes. Your history doesn't entitle you to a future. The market owes you nothing, no matter how many millions you've sold or how many decades you've dominated. The only thing that guarantees survival is the willingness to keep moving, keep listening, keep evolving. Elgin stopped. And time, the one thing they understood better than anyone on Earth, ran out. But if there's a silver lining in the wreckage, it's this. The lessons don't expire. Unlike the company, unlike the factory, unlike the watches themselves, the lessons last. Every ticking clock is a reminder. Time doesn't wait. Not for empires, not for giants, not for anyone.